The wrong track is already confirmed, not suspected, not loosely favored. Confirmed. Inside modern radar confirmation systems, that is where the failure begins. Not when the screen goes dark. Not when the contact disappears. Not when the radar loses the field. The failure begins earlier. At the moment, one track is stabilized with enough certainty for the structure to start treating it as command truth. That is the threshold. Because radar confirmation is not just observation made clearer. It is uncertainty being compressed into something the rest of the system can act on. A field can still be crowded. Returns can still compete. Motion can still conflict. Signal behavior can still resist clean interpretation. But once one track is granted confirmed status, ambiguity stops carrying equal weight. The structure begins narrowing around that result. Readiness shifts toward it. Attention organizes around it. Review begins orbiting it. The confirmed track starts receiving the kind of trust that changes what happens next. And that is the danger. Because the system does not need to lose the real threat in order to fail. It only needs to certify the wrong one strongly enough for everything downstream to begin inheriting that mistake as if it were reality. That is how false confirmation becomes structural, not through blindness, through confidence. The screen still looks alive. The radar still looks functional. The contact picture still appears organized. Nothing about the image has to look broken. That is what makes this kind of failure so dangerous. The structure can look disciplined while the error is already gaining weight inside it. Because confirmation does not announce itself as risk. It arrives as resolution. It gives the system a track that appears stable enough to trust and coherent enough to move around. And the moment that happens, the wrong contact stops behaving like one possibility among many. It starts behaving like the answer the system has been waiting for. That is the moment the authority inside the picture begins moving toward the wrong track. And once confirmation begins carrying command weight, the mistake is no longer sitting inside interpretation. It has entered the sequence. The next problem is not that the wrong target was confirmed. The next problem is that confirmation begins attracting protection. Because confirmed tracks do not remain neutral for long. Once a radar confirmation system stabilizes one target as real, the rest of the structure begins treating that result as the safest place to commit attention. Operators review it first. Controllers align around it. Readiness starts orienting toward it. Surveillance discipline starts favoring it. Timing starts bending toward it. The field may still contain contradiction. Other returns may still behave more dangerously. New motion may still suggest that the real threat sits elsewhere. Patterns at the edge of the picture may still indicate that the confirmed track does not deserve the authority it is receiving. But those competing signals now carry less weight than the confirmed track already sitting at the center of the structure. That is how the imbalance grows. Not because alternative signals vanish, because they are forced to compete against something the system has already promoted into accepted reality. And accepted reality is difficult to weaken once multiple layers have started using it. The track is now easier to defend than to doubt. It has history. It has continuity. It has already absorbed review. It has already survived enough seconds inside the structure to begin feeling earned. Every second it remains confirmed makes it look more legitimate. Not because it is becoming more true, because the structure is becoming more invested in it. This is where false confirmation begins hardening into operational weight. The radar picture no longer behaves like an open field. It begins behaving like a filtered field. One track keeps receiving reinforcement. Everything else must now fight for relevance against a target the system has already taught itself to trust. That makes contradiction slower, and it makes warning harder to escalate, because the structure no longer treats conflicting evidence as equally actionable. It begins treating it as a challenge to a conclusion already carrying internal authority. So the problem grows quietly. Confidence gathers faster than correction. The wrong track becomes easier to maintain than to reopen. and the structure begins moving toward the point where contradiction is still visible, but no longer strong enough to redirect the response. That is the escalation, not noise increasing, not the field becoming unreadable. The escalation is that the system becomes progressively more certain of the wrong thing while preserving the appearance of order. Once that point is reached, the system starts acting from inside false certainty. The radar confirmation layer does not need to issue dramatic commands for this to happen. It only needs to keep feeding the structure the same confirmed answer long enough for action to begin forming around it. Now the confirmed track receives priority handling. Monitoring stays fixed on it. Support systems inherit its status. Response logic begins treating it as the object most deserving of protection, tracking, or interception. Meanwhile, the rest of the field starts losing decision weight. Not because those returns are absent, because they are no longer carrying the same authority. The structure has already ranked certainty above reconsideration. And once that happens, the confirmed track starts bending more than attention. It starts bending timing. Resources do not move evenly anymore. Review does not move evenly anymore. Urgency does not distribute evenly anymore. The confirmed target pulls sequence space toward itself. That is the action layer of the failure. A wrong track does not need to be perfect. It only needs to stay confirmed while the system keeps converting that confirmation into readiness. Now the architecture begins reinforcing its own error. The track remains central because action is building around it. And action keeps building around it because the track remains central. The loop closes quickly. Other signals arrive too late, too weakly, or too far outside the pathway already gaining control. A return that should have triggered re-evaluation now appears secondary. A pattern that should have reopened the picture now arrives after orientation has already narrowed. A contact that should have drawn immediate concern now has to fight against a response process already leaning somewhere else. The structure is still active, still responsive, still moving. But its movement is no longer organized around the real threat picture. It is organized around the confirmed one. That is the operational break. Because once a response architecture starts protecting the wrong certainty, correction is no longer trying to improve the picture. It is trying to interrupt a commitment already underway. And interruption always enters the system at a disadvantage. By then, personnel have already aligned. Timing has already shifted. Attention has already narrowed. The wrong track is no longer just sitting on a screen. It is shaping the response. That is why this failure becomes dangerous so fast. Because once the wrong target has been confirmed strongly enough, correction enters the structure as friction, not authority. The system does not greet contradiction as a reason to reopen the field. It begins treating contradiction as resistance against a track already carrying institutional weight. That changes the outcome. What should have interrupted the response now arrives as a weaker signal than the commitment already in motion. What should have reopened review now appears to threaten continuity. What should have exposed the false confirmation now has to compete with the cost of reversing it. And reversal always gets harder once readiness has started organizing around the mistake. That is the sequence. A wrong confirmation becomes accepted reality. Accepted reality begins attracting response. Response strengthens commitment. Commitment makes correction look destabilizing. Now the structure is no longer deciding between tracks. It is deciding whether it can afford to break from the wrong one. That is a much harder correction to make, because the system is no longer close to the original error. It is now living inside its consequences. The confirmed track has already shaped timing, already shaped resource focus, already shaped the response, already narrowed what the structure is prepared to believe. The authority break has already happened. Not because command consciously chose the wrong reality, because the structure handed command a version of reality that had already been hardened by false confirmation. From there, the loss of control does not come from chaos. It comes from disciplined commitment to the wrong target. And disciplined commitment is often more dangerous than confusion, because confusion still looks unfinished. False confirmation looks resolved. Confusion still invites hesitation. False confirmation invites execution. That is why the result is so severe. The system does not collapse before it fails. It remains coherent long enough to carry the mistake forward, as if coherence itself were proof. That is the doctrine behind the failure. A radar confirmation system does not become dangerous only when it cannot see clearly. It becomes dangerous when it can grant real command weight to the wrong track and still present that result as stable truth. Because confirmation is never just a descriptive act. Inside military systems, confirmation is authority entering the picture. It tells the rest of the structure what deserves trust, what deserves readiness, what deserves response, what deserves the next layer of institutional commitment. And once that authority is assigned incorrectly, the damage is not limited to the track itself. The whole sequence begins inheriting the error. That is why the governing problem is not misperception in the abstract. It is confirmation acquiring more operational power than correction can still overcome. A radar confirmation system is supposed to reduce uncertainty without falsifying command reality. It is supposed to help action converge on the real threat picture. It is supposed to strengthen decision quality, not preempt it with the wrong certainty. But the moment a false track can be stabilized strongly enough to organize review, timing, and readiness around itself, the system has crossed the line. It is no longer serving perception. It is governing it. And once that happens, the structure stops using confirmation as a tool of discipline. It begins using it as a mechanism of closure. That is the break. A radar confirmation system that can harden the wrong target into command truth is no longer verifying the field. It is converting error into sequence control. And once error reaches that level, the structure does not need to collapse to fail. It only needs to remain coherent long enough for the wrong confirmation to own the response. That is what makes this category so dangerous. Not that it produces a false image, but that it can produce a false certainty strong enough to survive inside disciplined process. The radar still appears credible. The system still appears controlled. The response still appears organized. But the organization is now serving the wrong truth. And when a military system can preserve order while protecting the wrong target as confirmed reality, the result is not simple misidentification. The result is command structure moving under false authority. The most dangerous radar error is not the track it misses. It is the one it confirms strongly enough to control what happens next.